everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? Can't help but laugh as I ask that question rhetorically. Although, hey, if you feel like answering out loud when you're listening to this, you know what? Live your life. Do what you gotta do. But the laugh, rueful, as always, rueful as every laugh is in these intros. I am recording this on the day that Texas defied the Supreme Court. I mean, already a non-democratic body, but still, to see a 19th century constitutional crisis type dealie happening in front of our eyes is, what's the word I'm looking for? Is there a word for surreal and scary and anxiety producing and piquing my curiosity? Whatever word captures all of those feelings at once. I guess that's what I'm feeling. But I'll tell you what else I'm feeling. I am feeling excitement because today is the 14th anniversary of Beginnings. Yes, that's right. 14 years ago, January 26, 2010. The first episode dropped. My old writing partner and I started this show together. We interviewed two of our friends, and now 14 years later, my old writing partner is no longer doing comedy, really, and one of our friends that we interviewed is no longer doing comedy, really. I'm still here. Our other friend, Aaron, still here. He most recently co-show ran the last couple seasons of Star Trek Lower Decks. And of course, on these anniversary episodes, I always try to have someone special, someone who means something. I mean, everyone on the show, that's how I book it. Everyone on the show, their art means something to me. But someone whose art really resonates with me. And today, my guest is Jonathan Lethem. And if you don't know who Jonathan is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, MacArthur Genius Grant-winning author Jonathan Lethem at first thought he was going to be a visual artist until some existential realizations about class and art in college in the early 1980s left him disillusioned. He dropped out, hitchhiked to California, and started writing while he worked as a clerk in used bookstores. In 1994, Harcourt Brace published his first novel, Gun with Occasional Music, and since then he's written a dozen more, just a sampling: Motherless Brooklyn, The Fortress of Solitude, Chronic City, The Feral Detective, as well as a number of short story collections. And this is just scratching the surface. Currently, Jonathan is the Roy Edward Disney Professor of Creative Writing and Professor of English at Pomona College, and his most recent book, Brooklyn Crime Novel, was published last October by HarperCollins, and like everything else Jonathan writes, it is great. This was very exciting for me. I've been a fan of Jonathan's books since I read, I want to say, Gun with Occasional Music was the first one I read, but no one's fact-checking me, and I don't know how to fact-check myself on something that happened like 20 years ago, so let's just say that. And while they say don't meet your heroes, one of the things I have found on this show is that what they really mean is, in 2% of the cases, don't meet your heroes. 98% of the time, you should, because they're usually pretty nice, and you will have a great conversation with them, which is what happened today. I loved the energy Jonathan came in with. This was before I started recording, but one of the first things he said, he goes in and goes, "All right, do you know how to say my name?" And I was like, "I don't think I do." He's like, "It's Lethem." I go, "I did not. I was going to go with the short E." I, of course, appreciate that. You know, my wife's last name is Ekparagan. She does that all the time. I get that, and I get the energy. I get where it's coming from. So already from moment one, we were on the same wavelength. And this is just a great talk. I won't spoil it anymore. I won't reminisce about old episodes of the last 14 years, because that's not what I do in this intro. What I do in this intro is say something cynical, give the bio for the guest, say a couple sentences about the interview, and then I do this next part, which is a little recommended if you like. I like to do this in the intro in case you're a new listener. I don't want to make you just wade through 14 years of interviews. I've done hundreds of episodes with writers and authors and comedians and actors and musicians and artists. It's a lot. So what I like to do here is a little recommended if you like. Jonathan's an author. What about other authors I've had on the show? Lincoln Michelle, Ben Marcus, Heidi Julavitz, Brian Evanson, Chuck Klosterman, Helen DeWitt, Rick Moody, Harry Matthews, Sam Lipsyte. So if you like this, check out those episodes. If you like that, why not subscribe to the show? Why not leave a review? Of course, you can find me on social media at Andy Beckerman. And coming up soon, I just talked to Jewel Taylor, who was the co-writer and director of one of my favorite films last year, They Cloned Tyrone. That was a very good talk. So stay tuned for that. But for now, enjoy this 14th anniversary episode with Jonathan Lethem. Just a softball question to start out.
Yeah.
Teaching in 2023. I'm very curious. I was teaching during the Bush years. I was a philosophy professor, and no one seemed to stop me from saying my political opinion. And it seems like everything I read now feels... I'm also assuming that we're somewhere on the same side based on your writing. I don't have to pin you down exactly in the political spectrum, but... Mm-hmm. It seems treacherous now, but I don't know. I just see things online, so I'm curious as your experience.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, there's a few things there. One is that, my general persuasion precedes me. So anyone who is anxious or wants to, screen for whether they're going to feel comfortable around who I am and what I think about they've got a tremendous amount of opportunity to kind of get a snapshot. Second thing is that most of what I do leaves explicit kind of news commentary, kind of like weighing in sort of reaction stuff to the wayside in search of more resonant, less topical, less immediate kind of utterances. And that's true whether I'm teaching literature or talking about creative writing. But the third thing is it doesn't make any sense to self-censor. So when there are reactions or descriptions that become explicit, then that's there and you talk about it. And, I'm in a very embracing teaching position, one that probably spoils me in a lot of ways. The most obvious is one that's generic, but is worth remarking on, is that I was granted tenure, right? So I'm not fearful in a sense of like making my living way. That's really intense for a lot of people. It's not my situation, but this environment also, I think, is not one where everyone's in some sort of simple, obedient consensus, but it's one that embraces conversation and, people aren't always leading with their most conflictual or anxious selves. I think by the nature, every institution has a kind of or like a room tone or something. Pomona College is not just a thoughtful place, that would probably go without saying for most any academic environment, but a very community minded zone. Mm. Now I don't want to be anodyne or suggest that like people don't suffer or conflict seek at times, that there's all kinds of aversiveness and risk. I mean, that's what community includes, right?
Yeah.
But I would also, I guess, the last thing I'd say connects to the last thing you mentioned in your thinking aloud, which is you've been out of that space for a long time, and so your impression is one that's gained online. And there's a lot of I think, strongly motivated exaggeration of the kind of absolutism and conflict in college campus discourse.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who want it to be kind of a hellscape that way.
Yeah. I think, that's in general a picture of, and I've been trying to get used to this since, I don't know what happened. Something happened in 2016. I don't know. But there is a dystopian depiction of the world online. And then my normal life, which obviously there are breakdowns and there are dystopian elements that leak into my daily life here in Los Angeles. But in general, I navigate the world in a, I'm not, there's not like holes in the concrete, that dip down into the sewers. There's not, there are tent cities. It's not like it is perfectly nice outside in Los Angeles, and you don't walk outside and see human misery, but it's not a Hooverville, I suppose. Yet the online depiction is, it's all like it's all over. And I guess that's what I guess I keyed into in some way.
I'm sure you can, it's very available. The idea that, at any given time, there are people quitting the scene, right, who are going to be eager to say, I can't do this anymore. The conversation doesn't work for me. I can't relate to the student anymore. That, if you're looking for that testimony, it's out there. But yeah, I think there's, like I say, I'd use the word motivated. There's a lot of motivated exaggeration. And, so this, we could get into a very elaborate conversation about the mediations of technology, the discourse online, and then we probably use our hour that way really easily. It's like a great example of dialectics, right? What you just said, it's not that you don't see the tent cities when you walk outside, but it's also not that you step outside into like an open chasm of fiery, sufferers. There are a lot of realities that coexist and nest together, and a lot of versions of experience, and that includes what I'm calling community. The fact that people are responding a lot of different ways to the stressors and the impacts of transformation. We live in a very transformative moment, right?
Well, this is the thing. I talk to a lot of people on the show, and I'm fascinated, I think, the most by people who were teenagers in the 70s, because that's really where the neoliberal period started. And
that's me. That's me in a nutshell. Yeah, watching Reagan and the way reality got paved over with this nostalgic attempt to, reconstruct something that never existed. And it was, in fact, just this like extraordinarily brilliant new sales pitch nightmare for a capitalism that had never existed before, and a destruction of all kinds of social bonds under the guise of like whatever, bringing America back against the pressure of the exploration of the world that my parents' generation made, for better and worse, with all kinds of error proneness and incompleteness, but the possibilities implicit in the transformations of the 60s and the early 70s, even in the breakdowns, and the way those got paved over by this monolithic thing, the right word for it is neoliberalism. Yeah. Even though it was the first brand was neoconservatism, first name on the package. Yeah.
Were you self-aware as a teenager? Did you see changes happening, or was it just like, you're in New York, it's already kind of, it's not doing great anyway at that time.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
not, so you don't see much of a difference. It's just, that's the way life was.
Well, I was embedded in my own really incredibly specific position, not just as a New Yorker, but as the child of people who experience themselves as being, I've used the word dissidents or bohemians. Sometimes the word might just be hippies, but that saw themselves as antagonistic to the culture at large. Even when there was a movement politics that they could identify with, they were working from a marginal position that I identified with automatically, as one does within a family, right? And so, I could judge what was happening in the larger space to an extent. It was all very, very antithetical. But I mean, the fact that that I was simultaneously heartbroken that McGovern wasn't elected as the first presidential election I remember, and at some level also, talk about your dialectical position, also conscious that my parents really would prefer to overthrow, this system entirely. It isn't to say they had either a party affiliation, because there wasn't a broad revolutionary movement to be part of by the time I remembered their lives. But that one could root for, let's say, Jimmy Carter against Ronald Reagan, and at the same time be disappointed by such enormous undercurrents in the way reality had betrayed the premises of the idealistic 60s. I was absorbing it all and trying to breathe, and also rebelling against it. I didn't become an anti-hippie Reagan youth. That wasn't going to work for me. But I did find my parents' reality oxygen suffocating to breathe at a certain point, and I wanted to sell all my mother's Eric Clapton records and buy LPs that they didn't like and understand, like the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks. So I was just trying to be a person with a world I could want to inhabit, and a lot of that involved running away for me. I was in some sense apolitical for a while against the intensity of their political disappointment, which didn't mean that I wasn't suspicious of the stuff that was being rolled out. I just basically ignored it. I didn't have a television in the 80s. I miss, this is a weird thing for me, is, generationally, I sometimes have to explain, there's a whole swath of everything that I just missed, because I was so committed to just reading old books and listening to old records and or really underground music. It's, and it isn't even bragging so much as it was just a way I was hiding from the construction, the Reagan era, which turns out to be the construction of the world that we now live in. And yeah. I ignored it as well as I could. Still haven't ever seen an episode of Roseanne or Friends. I didn't really know that this stuff was going to keep mattering. I think I just thought I would kind of bunker it out, and listen to Residence albums and go to Fred Frith shows and read old Philip K. Dick books and Fact Sheet 5 zines, and just I was like a underground person, which really isn't about a kind of a credibility brag so much as it's describing where my political reactions went under this construction that you're talking about. You wondered what I did with the world as a kid who'd kind of come out of, the first thing I remember practically is, I have memories from 1969. I'm like, sometimes people want to tell me I'm actually a boomer myself. And I was born in 64, which is like the year that people tend to put on the end of
really?
But I explain, whether it's persuasive to them or not, I know it's the case that you can't really have been raised by boomers and be one. You're Gen X if your parents were.
Right.
And so I'm the very oldest. I'm the most decrepit Gen Xer, but I'm not a boomer. And because I had them in my house to react against. So I was, I've been very resistant to these kinds of generational identifiers, but the older you get, the more you start to see that you're sort of actually are stuck as a product of certain kinds of reaction. And this, like seeing everyone as a sellout.
That, yes, there is a certain kind of thing. I want to get back to this kind of like Freudian familial dialectic in a second. But This is a thing I talk about so much on the show. And I am in the same version. I'm in the same world as you in a sense, about a generation apart. I am technically the youngest Gen X, but all of my ethical beliefs and all of my everything, all my pop culture references are all millennial. So even though I am born in 79 and technically, what these kind of like ethereal shifts.
So it's a decrepit Xer talking to the most decrepit millennial ever. Yeah,
exactly. So, but like something I grew up with was the idea you don't sell out. And I've actually had this very difficult contradiction that I've never solved that just lies in my chest, where I work in an industry where literally that's the point.
It's all you can want.
Yeah. A corporation pays me to write a script. And if I don't like that, then I don't eat, or I suppose if my wife was okay with it, I could live off of her and pretend like I'm somehow apart from it, but I would just be lying to myself.
Right.
If she was even okay with that, somehow
I have a big 5 publisher, we can also put some very strict limits on like who has and hasn't, disaffiliated, unless essentially, I'm blocking their name now. The great punk band that never had a label. I want it not Crass, although Crass I think was kind of like that. But there was an American
Black Flag. I mean, they had their own label.
Yeah. There's another I'm thinking of, but anyway, short of the kind of, it's very hard to be outside of the sphere of corporate capitalism. We all are carrying the phones made by slaves, right?
Yeah.
So it's important not to make people feel accused just for existing in the world that they didn't make. But so I made things. I guess this is about origin, so I can keep harping on this instead of thinking that we're supposed to get back to like the present.
No. We end in like 89, 90, 95, somewhere around there.
I made things even more intricate in a way for myself, or I made myself more confusing as a, like that. I joke that people will tell me I'm a boomer, and I know I'm not because I had boomer parents. But I even wrote an essay once called "Identifying with Your Parents." I was very fixated on the trying to understand where they'd come from. And that led me into complex cultural identifications, where a lot of what I resonated with the most, because it seemed, I think in a way I've never thought of myself as interested in history, but I'm very interested in the only historical novel I wrote is basically about the 1950s. It centers in the 50s. I'm very interested in the history of the world just before I appear in it.
Yeah.
And this construction of the world that my parents rejected, in fact, the kind of black and white, Eisenhower, beatnik space that then suddenly becomes Kennedy and Paisley, and, the Beatles get, they grow their hair out as soon as they appear practically. And I was like, didn't want to skip over to the current construction. I was like, what was just before? So I used to, comically, I used to have these arguments with my mother. I was like, she would catch me playing her records when I was really young, and I'd be playing like the Beatles yesterday and today, and she'd say, why are you listening to that when there's, Sergeant Pepper? Like, they got good. And I was like, no, I think they were kind of good back here. I'm interested in this black and white world. And I became fascinated with the television, like the Twilight Zone, because I was growing up under this set of assumptions that were, because everyone in my parents' sphere believed that they were just kind of the square world that had been overthrown. I was like, I think these things are deeper, and I want to figure out my relationship to them. So like, my parents had no interest in 50s rock and roll. It was really embarrassing to them. I was like, what's Elvis? Who's Rod Serling? I was into Lenny Bruce records. I was into the Beats, and my parents actually weren't especially. The books on their shelves. I mean, my mother had one Jack Kerouac novel, which I devoured, the Dharma Bums, but they were more into that utopian kind of next thing. And I was a little bit like, what does it feel like to be stuck in the 50s and resisting the monoculture then? Or was it a monoculture? Was it actually like a series of illusions? So I was into film noir, all these art forms that were like mid-century acts of resistance or interrogation of the American consensus, the post-war consensus under construction. I was like, I want to see it interrogated at the very beginning, from these positions of like science fiction and a comedy album, or the Beat Generation, when there was like 7 of them, when it wasn't just a hippie army, it wasn't Woodstock, it was like a few weirdos who everyone made fun of. And that prepared me in a way very nicely. My obsession with all of that positionality got me really equipped to survive the defeat of the hippie consensus. Because then I go into the Reagan 80s and I'm like, I want to be this dark, I make myself into a kind of a dark, critical, antithetical underground man, like to do the things I did and focus on the things I did was a little bit to be like Lenny Bruce in the Eisenhower years, or Philip K. Dick, like a worm in the cake.
Okay. How much of this process between you kind of pushing back against your parents' interests all the way up into the 80s, where you constructed yourself in a certain way, how much of it was conscious and how much of it was, I don't know if you can answer this, but like, if you can think back, how much of it was just like a gut instinct? Because this is the thing I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about your parents. I was trying to think back to my parents. I have my parents' ethical beliefs, and I've actually somewhat pushed beyond them. Without getting into it, I've somewhat pushed beyond their ethical beliefs, but I remember pushing against their aesthetic beliefs a lot. But some leak through. It's just as you were talking. Of course, it's a melange of porous.
The things you pit yourself against also become. There's the mask that eats into the face, right? Like my punk postures, which were really pretty, scant in retrospect. Like, what big, what did I do? I worked in a bookstore when I dropped out of college. And I listened to bands that played 2-minute songs instead of 7-minute songs. Well, I mean, what did that add up to as like a cultural revolution against my parents' world? In most senses, I was a hippie. I was an anti-hippie hippie. I'd absorbed their sense of, discontent and dreaminess, and their sense of, skepticism about anti-hedonistic elements in our culture. I was I wanted to be into sex and drugs. It wasn't fair if I was going to have to like reject all the good stuff just because it was theirs. So I found, workarounds. I found versions, right? And so you become made of the things you pit yourself against, as well as the things you decorate you urgently decorate yourself with as postures.
Yeah.
Both the mask eats into the face and the rear view mirror. Turns out you're driving with it all the way, glancing into it as you go. But conscious or unconscious, I can be pretty, in a good conversation like this one's already become, I can sound incredibly intentional as I try to articulate these things. And I've devoted some of my own writing energy to distangling them. I mean, I think you can see that in the semi-autobiographical novels, which is principally Dissident Gardens and Fortress of Solitude. They're indirect in ways that sometimes I think people take them as direct, but they still encode a lot of that kind of self-questioning or just trying to unravel the self-construction and give things names. So I can be pretty articulate about it, but I was mostly just gravitating to things I loved and that gave me consolation. The stuff that now I can say, oh, well, this was my, kind of my toolkit and my self-assembly kit, and also my equipment for, making my work, which I hope is effectively interrogating reality in some ways, right? Even if it doesn't have a simple ideological central position from which it emanates. It's instinct. It's a series of instinctive critiques and interrogations of things. I believe that, but I didn't get there by thinking I need this equipment. What am I going to need for this journey? I got there by freaking out, reacting, and falling in love with things, right? And I'm able to say now why the Marvel comics of the very early 70s, which was a kind of like broken time in that, the creepy end phase of the Silver Age, right? I think I'm saying I'm led there by seeing in the background of your shot, isn't that one of the X-Men, or am I?
Yeah, Nightcrawler.
That's Nightcrawler, right?
There.
The introduction of those new X-Men. I mean, ironically, that was like that was the comics getting good again in a lot of people's eyes, but it was the end point of my interest. I'd been making do with, Ghost Rider and Warlock, and there was something about, and the Defenders. I mean, what the hell was that?
I don't know. I mean, I know who they are, but
yeah, but this material, in retrospect, it was the first ironic, the seeds of all kinds of triumphant artworks, things like Watchmen, I think, are born in this, because those are the first comics made not by kind of cynical commercial art professional grown-ups who are like, what will the children enjoy? But they're actually made by fans of other comics who grew up all twisted and weird because they actually took comics seriously. So they're very deep in comics, and I can articulate this now. But at the time I was just like, this sense of creepy marginality, or second generation, vernacular American culture. My brother and I often joke about this. Like we're sort of little hard-boiled guys, right? We adopted this kind of street attitude that was a construction both of the idea of being from Brooklyn and of the available fragments of hard-boiled attitude that we could find. But this is a pre-internet, infinite jukebox world. We didn't get to see Humphrey Bogart movies. We got to see Woody Allen pretend to be Humphrey Bogart and play it against Sam. We got to hear Bugs Bunny do momentary imitations of Edward G. Robinson and Bugs Bunny, and we intuited that there was an attitude that and a style that might be sustaining for us, like a form of streetwiseness, or we'd see tiny bits of old movies on the movie of the week or something if we could stay up late enough, but we didn't know what it was we were making ourselves out of, because it was coming to us in fractured echoes through quotation and ironized sort of asides.
Yeah, or as punchlines.
Yeah.
My access to a lot of the stuff started out Tiny Toons, The Simpsons, because their writers for those things were in their 40s, 50s, somewhere around there. The things that they referenced were from the 20s and 30s. And so I access this stuff at first through this lens. And then only later do I watch whatever, The Third Man, I don't know. Like, only later do I see this stuff and understand it, as opposed to just knowing it at first or incorporating it into myself through as a joke.
We're all born into culture and then have to operate it backwards if we're curious at all to understand what it's made of, right? So, I mean, I talked about my instinctive childhood interest in my parents' discarded reality, the immediate post-World War II constructions and the reactors against it, the dissident artists like the Beats, or the early, like what it was to actually be, Jerry Lee Lewis or Elvis Presley. I mean, of course these are not very evolved humans, or Chuck Berry, but to make this crazy squawk against reality that was unprecedented at that time. I mean, we take it so for granted now. But the funny thing is, so you just alluded to what happened to me slowly, but almost, there was this deepening curiosity that pointed me actually past the threshold of World War II. And I started to see that most of what stirred me the most deeply in trying to understand what it was to be born in the last part of the 20th century took its form in reaction not to World War II, but to World War I. That surrealism and the hard-boiled style, what was the trench coat on the private detective a reference to? Trench warfare. What were all these guys, the writers and the characters they presented? They were all traumatized World War I veterans.
Yeah.
What were all the surrealists who invented this lexicon of a popular imaginative art form that becomes things like science fiction and the Twilight Zone? It's like a high thing that becomes immediately appropriated to all kinds of low forms. Low is the wrong word, but vernacular forms. So both the hard-boiled style and the surreal style are both reactions to the trauma of the collapse of the dream of modernity that is represented by World War I. Forget World War II. This is the world that really I had to figure out I came from, which is that, the world globalizes and there's this sort of party throne of possibilities. And then World War I shows everyone that modernity is a catastrophe, that the technological and communication revolutions could be employed just to make nightmares. And that's who invents the lexicon that I really dwell inside. The hard-boiled writers are traumatized World War I veterans. The modernists, Robert Musil and Kafka, and the European modernists, the surrealists, all of this sort of comes from this gut punch that everyone's sensibility has received, that global trench warfare, that the masses of dead, the pointlessness could just absolutely shake everyone's confidence in rationality and in the positive virtues of this technological revolution. The industrialization of the world turned out to be industrialized death.
Yeah. I mean, my pithy one-liner about it is that we're all living in the corpse of the Enlightenment, and just I like imagine it as this giant dead whale that we're all like that's rotting around us, and we're all kind of just like trying to like figure out like what does it mean to live in this rotting whale that was the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then yes, this is so okay. Did you because I also had the same kind of natural affinity for those things without having any kind of I ask a lot of these questions like, was it conscious or not conscious? Was it just kind of like a gut feeling? Because for me, I grew up in a very kind of repressed, I want to say household, just like I think the context, the whole kind of atmosphere, whether it was the 80s, whether it was Pennsylvania, I don't know, or whether it was my family, but like it was just a kind of like feeling of repression. And so all this stuff was I couldn't interrogate it until much later. Like, why was I drawn to surrealism? Why the Dadaists specifically? Why was I drawn to them? And I didn't know. Why was I drawn to film noir? Like, why did it feel good and I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah, well, it's telling you you're not crazy to see the fissures in the monolith that's being presented to you. So of course it feels good. I always had the same reaction. I was like, thank God, I'm not alone. It's how I felt when I first, read Philip K. Dick at, whatever it was, age 13. I was like, oh shit, okay. Somebody saw it before me this way. And, and I have that, I have that sense of reassured bleakness, when I associate it with Rod Serling. I associate it with film noir, and with obviously with also the great and most articulate 20th century literary artists who lay it all out there. I don't really go back to this very often, because I think in terms of the interests that I developed in the form of the novel later on, I was like, yeah, I'm not sure that's the kind of novel writing that I revere. But I read Sartre's novels when I was a teenager. And I was like, yeah, okay. I'm not in this path alone. It's very reassuring. Even just that the title of the book would be called Nausea. Yeah.
Yes. I'm literally just thinking that as you were talking.
Sometimes you just decorate yourself with the most fundamental badges of recognition that, you're being sold a lot of stuff crap is being choked down your throat. And I can only imagine the Reagan 80s in Pennsylvania. I had very different array of indicators in the adults around me and their cultural involvement, but they were, as is classical for that generation, who made the commitments, cultural, personal, and political, that my parents did. Again, we'll use hippies as a shorthand. They were under pressure of violent disappointment and collapse and exhaustion at what happened in the mid 70s. So I could borrow from their equipment in some ways, but if I let myself identify with their trajectory at that moment, it was going to be really, really, I was going to be, it would be, abort before launch. Right.
I mean, when you were a child, did your parents articulate these things to you, or was it stuff you just kind of absorbed and had to figure out?
No, I had to absorb it. I got messages, but they weren't congruent or I couldn't make there was no system you could make out of them. Some of them were very intense. One of the other elements for me is not just bohemianism, not just New York, but my grandmother's extremely aggrieved version of secularized, disaffiliated Jewishness, which So we just said you are what you reject as well as what you seek, right?
Yeah.
She was from a thing that she felt she'd abandoned and betrayed in favor of her intellectual atheist certainties. She was like, I couldn't do it. I don't believe. I'm not a believer. And further, she was a believer in something else, which was also a typical trajectory in the late 20s and early 30s when she was coming of age. My grandmother was a communist. She thought that the revolution was the religion, and that this was fundamentally, you couldn't be obedient to the faith of your fathers. She broke from her family. She broke from the religion she'd been brought up in. And then comes the Holocaust, which forces anyone with that familial legacy to be identified and paranoid. And also, of course, the utter betrayal of the Soviet Union, of all of the idealizations that her generation had made of it in the 20s and through the 30s. So this woman, by the time I know her, she's very powerful, very dark personality, is giving me multiple crazy ass messages. One is, it doesn't matter that not only your mother, but even your grandmother doesn't go to a temple and doesn't care and doesn't feel Jewish. We are. And if the day came when they were, handing out the Jewish stars again, she had a lot of that like heavy, we're doomed Holocaust message for me.
Yep.
But on the other hand, she had watched her daughter marry a Midwestern Protestant guy, my dad, which she approved and was comfortable with because she was godless herself. Her kids were not growing up Jewish in any sense, except that they were afraid. I was taken to Quaker Sunday school because that was what my dad was into when I was a kid. And so I didn't know what to make of this form of disaffiliated affiliation. But it was pregnant with paranoid, anxious sense of connection to a world that I couldn't fathom, and to a European legacy that, it was like I was being told you can't be one of these amnesiac, self-reinventing Americans like the myth of this country generates routinely. You're rooted in this other legacy that's gonna, it's gonna come back to haunt you. So that was another form of like, but so it was information, but it wasn't coherent information. And then, my solution in many ways was to make sustaining, since my parents' political, Aquarian age idealism was obviously being crushed by Reaganism. I couldn't live there. Mm-hmm. Couldn't live in a doomier, Europeanized world of faith that I'd never paid any attention to in any real way. The Quakers were nice, but I didn't believe in God either. My religion had to be art itself, and I had to see it as not apolitical in the reactionary sense of like, there are no politics in art. I kind of grasped that was nonsensical, nor that being a Mandarin, being kind of highbrow was going to mean that I should just invest in aristocratic ideals. That wasn't available to me either. I was too much the hippie kid. And I knew that I was poor. I was very poor. I mean, on a literal sense, the rich kids were visible to me. They were the ones in private school. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't really there. But if I invested in the idea that there was a cultural world where, in a sense, politics were sublimated in this critique of reality itself, the way that politics are subsumed in and expressed through allegorical forms, science fiction, film noir, surrealism. That was going to be a place I could live and thrive. So it's, I think in a way also pointed me on a very slow trajectory towards my willingness to read, cultural theory. I mean, it took me a long time to care. I kind of came to it through the back door of like reading Greil Marcus, or, and then ending up in academic. So I was sort of like in my face, but, actually seeing that people in my generation had around them a number of different, like 10, 20 years older than me. There were people writing intelligibly about what television had done to reality, like Mark Crispin Miller.
Yeah.
And I would start to glom onto this stuff, even though I didn't think of myself as interested in anything academic or theoretical. I was like, if it was about art that I cared about or mediums that I was involved in, I read a lot of theoretical stuff about film noir when I realized there's this whole vein of academic writing about it. And so, mostly those are Marxist critics, Marxist informed critics.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was, I was into the sublimation of my desire for a transformed world into various kinds of art. Most of it very dark, much of it what I would call vernacular. I try to avoid the word pop culture because I think, it's mostly wasn't popular. Mostly what I liked was failed popular art.
I like vernacular. I really like that as a term. Yeah.
I thought it doesn't really make sense to claim that like 10 issues of Omega the Unknown are pop art when nobody wanted to read them except, like me and 100 other people. That's not really pop. It's not, it's not Superman, nor is it, on the top 40 charts. It's not, it's like The Residence, old movies, it was kind of like subterranean termite art.
Yeah. Do you think that, have you ever watched any Adam Curtis documentaries?
I not only am very interested in Adam Curtis and have watched an inordinate number of his documentaries. I've gone through cycles of disenchantment and reenchantment with him. But I interviewed him. One of the only interviews he ever gave to an American, a major American cultural institution was. I went to England and hung out with Adam Curtis for 3 days and wrote about it for the New York Times Magazine.
Wow.
So you can check that out if you want.
I do.
He was extremely crucial for me, and I still think that certain of the early ones are. I think that the stylistics of his work got increasingly abstract. But the ones about technology, about economics,
mm-hmm.
and about psychoanalysis, that are, however much he disclaimed this, they're more like documentaries because they're interrogating factual areas. They're
Mm-hmm.
less about the sensibility that he arrived at. Those things seem to me incredibly incisive.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And I'm curious about, so one of the larger critiques I take from him is that, you had your parents' generation, right? We'll call the hippies, right? Fail in their attempt to change the world. And so they like went inwards. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
when the reason I brought up is because when you just said how like you took these like kind of political insights and then put them into art, it's interesting. I think there is this kind of your generation and my generation, or generally the people who grew up in the like 70s, 80s, 90s, of doing that, of like, all right, taking this idea like, well, we can't change the world, but we can at least like say, like encode these political beliefs in art. And then now you have this next generation that's just like, well, that didn't work. And so they are flailing at the moment without having a kind of like
Yeah.
a center yet.
Well, I mean, also they've had instilled in them an enormous suspiciousness that they're being used or tricked.
Yeah.
And surveyed, and so there's a deep anxiety about being misunderstood that it's taken me a really long time to assemble even like a working composite of like my concern of a concern about being misunderstood. But so my partner, my girlfriend, is 6 years younger than I am, but she's also, I think, politically and culturally more, I don't know what to say, but more forward looking than me, where I've been so past oriented, so identified with, excavating lost cultures. She's been very on the, so, she also teaches creative writing, and she's closer in sensibility and awareness and political style to her students than I could ever imagine being to mine, because of this forward lookingness. And she has consistently had to point out to me that things I think are self-evident in my political views inside my art are apt to be misunderstood by present readers, or even when I speak aloud, because I don't make them explicit enough for a period when people, I think in good and bad ways, their appetite for explicit, declarative commitment to politics is so intense. And I still deal with this aversive feeling of like, if you don't see it at this point, if it isn't obvious to you what I'm committed to, saying it out loud isn't going to help.
Yeah.
You just don't, you're just not really reading what I'm doing, and so, okay, fare thee well. Like, I don't have that anxiety about being misunderstood, because it seems, I don't want it to seem like I just think it's gauche to be direct, but it seems to me pointless. Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I might be part right and part wrong about that, just as their desire for the explicit avowal of committed political position is, I think, part right and part wrong.
Yeah, I go too far in that direction. I go too far to like, oh, you'll figure it out from, 3 lines of like avant-garde something. And then people are like, I have no idea what you mean to be saying this. And then I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'll be a little more explicit. But okay, we're right at the end, and there's like one last question that's been rolling around in my head. And it's, in this whole kind of like dialectical movement between all these things, the not to be too pretentious, but the Hegelian Aufhebung of this all, of this roiling kind of subjectivity that is you when you're growing up. How does your ambition form in this? Because originally you wanted to be an artist, a painter, I suppose. Yeah. I was reading, and it wasn't explicit about what kind of art necessarily, but I just assumed it was in the vein of your dad.
Mostly painting, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious if that was like a specific thing that formed and you're like, yes, that's what I want to do, or if it was just, I like what my dad does, I'm going to follow that out. Like, where did it form? How did it form?
Yeah. So, well, this kind of pulls me back to another description, which is in some ways a very simple one, and one I find myself sharing frequently with students, and even with colleagues when I talk with other writers. When I'm convivial with other writers, which is that I didn't have this kind of hedge to leap over, this impossibility to defy that most creative people experience, which is that, like, it seems unfathomable. Their parents, whether implicitly or explicitly, are like, that's not how people live. Art is made by others, by unimaginable people who are both maybe strange, or maybe they're godlike, or just it's not available. But I just, because of my dad's studio practice, which I should say he's still alive, he paints in my garage back here. He's 91. He works almost every day. His devotion and the clarity of purpose, the just working regularly, just making things, bringing forth his imaginative life onto these canvases. It's just such an extraordinary thing that I've had access to my entire life. Almost literally my first memory is of entering his studio as like a 3-year-old, toddling into it, crawling up the steps. So I always just knew in my body that this is something people could spend their time on, is dwelling. It was legitimate. It was ordinary in a sense that what your parents do is, of course, automatically ordinary to you.
Right.
And it was possible. And also, he was convivial with other painters. So I was meeting other people who did this. And my mother loved artists and she liked writers. And there was just the sense that, I could see the people around me, with my father preeminent among them, who had just chosen this form of engagement. And I knew it was for me before I had to think twice. I never received the message that, you ought to get over that impractical, dreamy thing. It was more like, what am I going to make? And I cycled through a lot of different, you asked about paintings. Well, I made sculptures for a while too, but also because I was so ravenously interested in narrative and things that paintings and sculptures kind of couldn't do, the way they existed in time seemed like a limitation to me, but also their ability to reproduce language. I'm obviously especially my mother was a kind of a bon vivant and a talker and a reader, and she handed me lots of books and read me lots of books, and listening to her and her friends talk was intoxicating. I always was engaged with language. So this desire to work in narrative and time and language pulled against my aptitude, which I did inherit from my father, to make paintings and sculptures. So I almost immediately began to think about these some alchemical combination. At first I thought, obviously I'm going to be a filmmaker or a comic book artist, because all of my art skills, which were, I was getting a lot of props for how, I was a little art prodigy because I'd been doing it all my childhood, and I did inherit like a hand-eye coordination thing. I could kind of make stuff that impressed adults a lot. So I wasn't going to give that up right away. So I thought, okay, well, I'm into visual stuff, but I want to tell stories. I'll do comic books, or I'll be a filmmaker. This seemed really almost obvious to me. And at one point I wanted to make animated films. And then at some point the interest in narrative and language just began to center. I was such a voracious reader. I had so many favorites who were just writers, beginning with Ray Bradbury and Raymond Chandler, and then Philip K. Dick was explosive for me. But also I found Kafka very early on. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand what I was reading, but it was radically important to me. And I was like, okay, it doesn't matter that I'm kind of good at painting. I don't, and I began to see the compromises and the struggles inherent in making film. I was not a great collaborator. I wanted to do it all myself. Uh-huh. And I didn't need to make comic books. I realized, drawing the same face over and over again 100 times, I don't have the patience for this. So I just was like, I get it. I'm going to be a writer. And but it really was just like sorting through the versions of manifesting this desire until it was clear which one was going to be the real focal point for me.
Yeah. Was it okay? And I don't know if this is answerable, but like, I was just thinking about my own thing. So, I was going to be in academia. I was going to write philosophy, and I hit too many barriers of stuff I wanted to do. It was too annoying to deal with having to write just a bog standard paper on Aristotle when I wanted to write on Heidegger's lectures on Aristotle, and they wouldn't let me, right? And, I would hit these walls about what I wanted to do and what they wanted me to do. And it just was not, it was too annoying. And what I loved was writing comedy. And I'm willing to put up with whatever I have to in entertainment in order to write comedy. Whereas I wasn't willing to put it up. Was that like that for you, where you just hit these things where like, this is too annoying and I to do this?
Well, first of all, the first thing I wanted to do was just write like the stuff that turned me on. I wanted to initially, I think the very first impulses were to make science fiction short stories, kind of like Ray Bradbury, poetic, dreamy ones. I knew I wasn't going to be like a science fiction writer who was serious about science. That was obvious. But the sort of, mythic literary type of thing that Theodore Sturgeon or Bradbury wrote. And then I wanted to write like Philip K. Dick and Raymond Chandler, which is quite almost embarrassingly, bluntly manifest in my first novel, right? It's like I just basically cross-pollinated those two styles. But I didn't think about where it went, because the other thing about my dad was that he wasn't making a living from painting. He was a teacher sometimes, and he was a carpenter, a contractor, and a cabinet maker most of my childhood. So the other illusion I didn't have was that you get instantly rich and famous. I was like, yeah, I'll probably have to do other stuff. Most of my heroes, I investigated a little bit. You didn't have to look far to realize that people struggled, suffered. That my bohemian, first of all, my hippie upbringing was a good preparation, because most people who I liked, the writers I liked, lived struggling lives or marginal lives, but also they often were making a living from some other thing, journalism or teaching or that, I wasn't deceived. So I also, I was really into being a bookseller, an antiquarian expert. I mean, I worked at 8 different used bookstores before I quit to write full time when I was 32. That's a lot of used bookstores. I was really in that world. I still miss it badly. I still actually kind of aspire to get back to it. I want to start a bookstore again before I die. I'm going to sell all the stuff I've piled up. So I was like, yeah, that's cool. I'm going to write stuff and have a trade, a guild. I'll be in a guild. I'll be a bookseller. And I sure, I could entertain the fantasies of, having my books optioned for the movies or, getting famous. Those weren't incompatible. I didn't not have those fantasies, but I was also very cool with never making a living from it. It either was going to be fine. I knew I wanted to tell stories. And so, in fact, I write about this a little bit in the cycle of essays that got collected in the Ecstasy of Influence. I was kind of confused when I became a less of a dark horse type of writer. I kind of always thought, with what I want to write, I'm going to be like published in paperback originals and, have a few people who get it. And then maybe I'll be rediscovered or appreciated when I'm dead. I was not setting up in my mind to be placed in a more central kind of pedestal in literary cultural space. It really threw me for a big loop. What took me years to reorganize around that I was being taken so seriously.
Yeah, how did you emotionally? How did you deal with that when you think you're an outsider, and then you realize, oh wait, I'm actually people are on the same wavelength as me. They're resonating. It's obviously the simplest thing to say is how grateful you are to be making a living, first of all, from a thing you weren't sure you ever could. I mean, there's very basic, kinds of amazement and gratitude, but then you can see the traps really readily too. And you are, unless you're a miracle worker, you fall into a few of them. And I did fall into a few of them just in terms of how I was allocating my time and energy, if nothing else. But you can also start to see it, like any artist should see nearly anything at some point. Like, what can I do with this? What can I make out of this? Okay. I can slow down and write a really long book because they're going to publish a long book. That's interesting. Let me work with this. What are the creative opportunities that it represents? That's interesting. Jonathan, I could keep talking to you for hours. I don't want to take any more of your time, though. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's a gas. It's a really good talk. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye.